Alex Lockwood is an educator working in the fields of writing, media, environment, and human-animal studies. He writes about animals, vegan life, and running. He works in England at the Center for Research in Media and Cultural Studies at the University of Sunderland. In 2014, he received a fellowship that allowed him to travel around the United States and Canada and work with animal organizations. In his resulting book, The Pig in Thin Air, he presents an exhilarating story with autobiography, social commentary, and media analysis. When I read his book, I was impressed by his candor in revealing how he came to terms with his self-destructive habits and changed his relationship with his own body. Then he explores the dimensions of embodiment from his body to the bodies of the animals he bears witness to, and the bodies of humans who take risks that put their bodies in danger when they are in the path of the killing system. Alex helps us make sense here in a world where so much is disembodied. He looks for ways that animal advocacy and environmental activism can join forces to address interconnected crises. By email, I asked Alex about something amusing that I could include in his introduction. Introduction should have some humor, you know. He replied that I could say that he was almost arrested by the police for causing mischief outside a slaughterhouse. That doesn't sound very funny to me, but those Brits have a different sense of humor, I think. We're delighted to also welcome Jean Bauer. Jean has been called the conscience of the food movement by Time magazine. For 30 years, he has traveled around the country to raise awareness about animal abuse in factory farming. He is a pioneer in the field of undercover investigations. His pictures and videos exposing factory farming brutalities have aired internationally, educating millions about the plight of farm animals. Jean has also testified in courts and before legislatures to advocate for better conditions for farm animals. He won the first ever cruelty conviction at a U.S. stockyard and introduced the first U.S. laws to prohibit harsh confinement systems in 3 states. His new book is Living the Farm Sanctuary Life. Some folks have already been able to buy these books tonight, and they'll be on sale in the lobby after the presentation tonight as well. Jean began his activist career selling veggie hot dogs out of a VW van at Grateful Dead concerts to fund farm animal rescues. Now he's the president of Farm Sanctuary. They have shelters in New York and California that provide rescue, refuge, and adoption for hundreds of farm animals each year. Visitors can connect with the animals there as the emotional, intelligent individuals that the animals and the humans are. Jean believes that these animals in the sanctuaries stand as ambassadors for the billions on factory farms who have no voice, and he has dedicated his career to advocating on their behalf. Please join me in welcoming Jean Bauer and Alex Lockwood.
Wow, well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. It's pretty wild to be here in a church, right, with this. It's great to see so many people here who are interested in these issues and thinking about our food system and trying to make a difference. And for those of you who are vegan, Thanks for coming. I'm a vegan since 1985. For those of you who are not vegan, thank you for coming. Thank you for being open-minded. Thank you for being curious about what these issues are. And for many people, myself included, we grow up eating in a certain way without really thinking about it. I grew up eating meat, dairy, and eggs. My parents ate meat, dairy, and eggs. Everybody around me ate that way, so I just started doing it. We are social animals. We tend to do what those around us do. But as time went, and as I learned about the harm that this industry was causing to animals and to the earth, and when I learned that I could live without eating other animals, I thought, if I can live well without causing harm, why wouldn't I? So I went vegan in 1985. In 1986, co-founded Farm Sanctuary, felt that it was important to see firsthand what was happening, so started investigating farms and stockyards and slaughterhouses, and we would literally find living animals thrown on piles of dead animals. And so we started rescuing them, and that's how the whole sanctuary rescue aspect of our organization began. And it was to help those individuals who had been discarded, and it was also, in some sense, to help heal us. Because going into these horrible places time after time, seeing animals in crates, pigs, for example, in gestation crates, which are these 2-foot wide metal enclosures where they're packed for their whole lives, unable to walk, unable to turn around. They're constantly scraping against these metal bars. They have bruises on their bodies from the confinement and pressing against the bars constantly and laying on concrete. You walk into these places, the air is thick with toxic fumes from their manure. They're screaming, they're clanking against the bars, they want out. So seeing that time after time is difficult. And being able to rescue the animals and watch them heal at Farm Sanctuary, in a sense, helped to heal us. One of the best parts, I think, of our humanity is our empathy, our ability to feel something when we see somebody else hurt. And in the factory farming industry, people have to lose that. Can you imagine what it would be like to work in a slaughterhouse or to work in one of these factory farms? To look at these animals as living creatures and to recognize that they are suffering and that you, us humans, we are imposing this on them, creates sort of this, I think, psychological dissonance. Because most people are compassionate, most people have empathy, most people don't want to cause harm to others. But at the same time, we have this massive industry where every year in the US, there are 9 billion farm animals that are raised in horrible conditions. And there are consumers. Most of us here grew up this way and maybe still are, consuming products from animals that are treated in these horrible ways. And that's just the norm. Temple Grandin, one of the livestock industry consultants who advises on humane handling, has said bad has become normal. And I think in terms of how animals are treated, bad has become normal, but also in terms of how we eat, bad has become normal. So in this country, we're eating food that is not only causing animals to suffer terribly in these factory farms, but we're eating food that's making us sick. It's been estimated that we could save 70% on healthcare costs by shifting to a whole foods plant-based diet. 70%, that's massive. How many of you have seen the film Forks Over Knives? So a lot of you have seen it. So that film and the experts in it talk about this. There's another film out called Cowspiracy that's now taking on the environmental issues, and they talk about how animal agriculture is causing all kinds of harm, and a lot of mainstream environmental groups really haven't taken this on. The United Nations also put out a report called Livestock's Long Shadow, and in it they talked about how animal agriculture is one of the top contributors to the most serious environmental problems we're facing. So this is, and that includes climate change. Animal agriculture contributes more to climate change than the entire transportation industry. So this is an industry that harms animals, it harms us, it harms the environment. It is not something we generally feel good about. When the issue of factory farming comes up, people will often say, don't tell me, I don't want to know. It's too upsetting. But I think it's important for us to take responsibility and to look at what we're doing and then ultimately make choices that we can feel good about. So in Living the Farm Sanctuary Life, we talk about 5 tenets of living the farm sanctuary life. The first one is to live and eat in alignment with our values. So we don't have to say, don't tell me, I don't want to know. The second tenet is to engage in a mindful relationship with other animals. And this has been shown actually to improve our own health as well as the health of other animals. When we're interacting in a positive way, it actually helps to reduce stress, reduce heart disease. Living well among other animals improves our lives. The third tenet is to engage in a mindful relationship with our food so that we're thinking about where it comes from and not overeating, not eating too fast, which can tend to lead to overeating, and not eating food that makes us sick, which is what we do in this country. Fourth tenet is to eat plants for our health. As I mentioned, we can save on huge healthcare costs in this country and prevent a lot of human suffering if we ate food that was good for us. And if you look at us biologically, we are much more suited to eating plant foods as opposed to animal foods. A natural carnivore has a very short intestinal tract because meat is a putrefying piece of flesh and it has to get through quickly. But human beings have a very long intestinal tract. So it can take days for a piece of putrefying flesh, meat, to get through our bodies. And that's not good for us. And if we were natural carnivores and we saw an animal who was injured or bleeding or dying, we would start salivating. But we don't generally do that. So there's all these kind of indicators that we're not really natural carnivores. And there's a book by Harvey Diamond a number of years ago, and in it he asked this question, and I included it in Living the Farm Sanctuary Life. If you take a child and put him in a room with a rabbit and an apple, and if he plays with the apple and eats the rabbit, I'll buy a new car. You know, it's not generally the way we do things. And then sometimes people say, well, what about plants? They have feelings too, right? So there's that kind of pushback sometimes on this idea that we want to prevent suffering, so we say we're not going to eat animals. Other people will say, well, plants feel too. And, we could talk about the science and how we clearly understand animals and their nervous systems. And with plants, it's a little bit grayer. But even if you were going to say, yes, there is this possibility that plants have feelings or suffer, by eating plants directly, you're killing far fewer, because in order to raise animals for food, you have to grow tons and tons of corn and soybeans, which is then harvested and fed to animals. So if you really care about plant suffering, you should eat plants directly instead of eating animals, because that causes many more plants to die. And then you can also deal with it in a more human way, which is if you're taking your child to see where their food is produced, it's a very different experience going to an orchard or a berry patch as opposed to going to a slaughterhouse, right? So there's different ways to kind of address those kinds of things that sometimes people say. And then the fifth tenet of living the farm sanctuary life is to eat plants for the well-being of the planet. And I referred to the United Nations report talking about animal agriculture being one of the top contributors to the most serious environmental problems we're facing. So this is an industry that causes so much harm. Most people are unwittingly part of it. And people are afraid of change. We talk about how we are the rational animal. I think it's much more accurate to say that we're the rationalizing animal. And we especially rationalize if we don't feel very good about something. And this is why, in some cases, bringing up these issues, being vegan in a non-vegan environment, can get pretty passionate and challenging and testy, right? People become kind of all worked up about it. And us vegans, we vegans, are criticized for being emotional. But, I've been yelled at by these factory farmers where you see their veins popping out, and they get pretty emotional too. We are emotional animals. And so one of the biggest obstacles, I think, to change is fear. A fear of change, a fear of not getting adequate nutrients, a fear of not being accepted in a social environment. And so to the extent that we in the vegan movement can make steps easier and less scary, I think will continue to have success. And I think, Northwest Veg here has this vegan mentoring program. So some of you here may be mentors. Some of you who are not vegans, there are vegan mentors happy to work with you on how to do this. And that can be so helpful because, as I mentioned before, we are social animals. And often we need help learning from others. And we can learn good habits. And that's why coming together at events like this and other events that are held in Portland and in other places are very important. And I'll just close with one quick thing, and then Alex will come up here, and then we'll be up here a little bit together. And then I actually have to leave at 8 because I've got a plane to catch. But so I'm sorry I've got to leave that soon. But being vegan to me is an aspiration to live as kindly as possible. It's not an ingredient list. It's an aspiration. Because if it was an ingredient list, technically I shouldn't be eating organic produce because it's probably grown on an organic farm with animal manure, possibly from a factory farm. So technically that wouldn't be vegan if it was an ingredient list. But I eat that and I think it's a good thing. So it's an aspiration to live as kindly as possible, I believe. And each of us is on our own path. Each of us needs to do the best we can. And recognize that we are challenging certain assumptions about humanity and our place on the planet. And sometimes people ask, where do you draw the line? And I'll just close with a story about when we first started at Farm Sanctuary. We were, rescuing animals from the dead pile, taking goats or sheep out of trash cans and bringing them to the veterinarian. And we were spending hundreds of dollars. And these veterinarians wondered, why are they spending so much time and energy on these animals that are worth nothing economically? Or if they got healed completely, they would be worth far less economically than we were spending. And it took us a while to impress on these folks that to us, these animals were not economic units. They were individuals. They were our friends, not our food. We wanted to do what we could to help them as fellow earthlings, not as commodities. So the veterinarians finally came around and accepted that and started recognizing that we had this kind of relationship with these animals. And that's, a big part of what we do at Farm Sanctuary and what other sanctuaries do as well. So they got that message. And then on the farm, there was this rat that we saw on a regular basis. And one day this rat looked pretty sick. So we called the vet and said, we've got this rat here. And there was a lot of consternation about seeing the rat. But they finally agreed to see the rat, who was in bad shape, and the rat was euthanized. A couple weeks after that, our sheep had worms. They had parasites. So I called the vet and I said, I have this worm here. And there was a very long silence on the other side of the phone. What do you want us to do for the worm? And so I explained that the worm was a parasite and we needed medicine for the sheep. And so we kind of drew the line there. So the point I'm making is that, you do the best you can and you live in a way that is as conscientious and as mindful as possible, and you learn as you go, and we learn from each other. So it's wonderful to be here with you all, and I'll just open it up for Alex now, and then we'll talk a little bit afterwards and do some Q&A. All right, thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Gene. And I want to express deep gratitude to the Unitarian Church, particularly Keith, who has helped organise this event, and Steve for a wonderful introduction, and for all of those who've made us feel very welcome here. I've been on a tour now around the UK and the US with a book for a couple of months. I've been over here for a month, travelling around East Coast and West Coast. And Portland was one of the places that I didn't make it to on my fellowship 2 years ago, which was a disgrace, really, in terms of the work that you do here. So I'm very, very happy to be here. About 3 years ago, I put up on the wall of my office a big sign, a handwritten sign that I'd made that said, "How do we change our relationship as a species to other species?" Because I'd been vegan for about 4 years before that, so I've been vegan now for about 7 or 8 years, and I was vegetarian before that. But I hadn't yet made the shift into thinking that I needed to do more, that being vegan for me wasn't enough, and I wanted to act. And that action for me was about changing our relationship as a species to other species. I started work with marine conservation and education, and out of that grew this fellowship that brought me over to the US. And one of the things that had really made me understand that I needed to do more was actually reading Gene's book, his first book, Farm Sanctuary. That was all about changing hearts and minds. And I went, I want to go to this place, and I need to go there, and I need to meet these people who are working. And I know my introduction, the story that I gave Steve wasn't very funny, but often working in animal advocacy isn't very funny. But I wanted to meet Gene, and I went to Farm Sanctuary, and Gene was incredibly sort of generous with his time, as were everyone there. But I write about it in the book that when I actually arrived, Farm Sanctuary is the home for the animals, and we are there in their place, in their home. And one of the tenets of Farm Sanctuary is that you go on there, you don't take animal products onto the farm. And so I turned up, and I had to stop the car and pull over because I was wearing a leather belt. And so I took off this belt. And thought, well, I can't wear it on there. But because I'd been on this tour, I'd actually lost a bit of weight. And so I spent the entire day with Gene, worried that my pants were going to fall down at any moment. So I was on edge for the entire day. And when I got home that night, I think I took off a shoelace and tied it around my pants. But my time at Farm Sanctuary was really formative in understanding where good animal advocacy, good, effective animal advocacy. So the book that I've written is all about that journey. It's about how I became an activist and advocate for animals, and then what kind of advocate could I be, because I was new to it. So I was meeting Gene at the very beginning of my journey as an activist, as he was 30 years into his. And I learned a lot. I learned a lot about the different forms of activism and whether it's confrontational or invitational, meeting people where they're at, or being very hardline and drawing that line much, much further along. And one of the big things that I sort of really focused on was what Gene spoke about earlier, about this sense of the encounter with other animals, and our bodies being the things with which we encounter the other, and how important that is. And if we have very unhealthy bodies, if we're eating badly, if we're not taking care of ourselves, and if we're living in cultures and structures where actually being good in our bodies and relating to other animals and being mindful in those relationships is very difficult for us, then that's something that we need to address as advocates. So the book and my work is very much about that. It's about how do we change our relationship with others. And for me, that change is all about bodily change. It's about the encounter with animals, being mindful, being moral, being respectful. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to, because I know Gene needs to leave, so I want to make sure that we get a lot of time for Q&A and discussion. So I'm just going to read the little bit from my book. There was a story from Farm Sanctuary. And how many of you have been to Farm Sanctuary? So quite a few. Who's been to New York? And have you met Susie? Yeah, well then you know what a wonderful person, an amazing person Susie is. And she's the National Shelter Director at Farm Sanctuary, and she cares for a lot of the animals, and she's been there a long time. And I was privileged again to get this time to spend with her, and also learn a lot about this encounter and this relationship between our bodies and the bodies of others. So I'm going to read this part out, and it resonates a lot with what Gene's already said, and then we'll open it up. So for the past 15 years, Susie Coston has been the National Shelter Director of Farm Sanctuary. It's her job to oversee the care of all the non-human animals, residents and those that pass through on their way to homes. Since the great majority of animals who arrive at farmed animal sanctuaries come from industrialised farms or stockyards, they suffer from complex injuries, serious illnesses and physical deformities, which Susie and her team deal with daily. When I met Susie on her last late shift, she was suitably unkempt for someone who'd been at work since 8 a.m. because there was so much to do. Susie had hand-raised many of the animals on the farm. Even now I still do the caregiving, she explained, at least once or twice a week. These animals know me. We have a bond. And this bond was maintained by, or rather in constant becoming with, their proximity. Out on the farm, our first stop was the chickens. A few years ago, Farm Sanctuary decided it would be a better experience if the chickens were allowed to run free rather than be kept in a shed. So they lifted the fences and gave room for the chickens to come in and out, and the experience for both visitors and chickens was transformed. The chickens are extremely friendly, explained Susie, and come running when anyone appears. They're also able to exhibit all of their chicken-specific behaviour in the open, such as dust bathing. The chickens recognised Susie, and when they ran to her. Susie and I walked into the feed shed. Here, she said, pouring seeds into my cupped hands. Miranda doesn't like to eat off the floor because she's been debeaked, and it hurts her. She prefers to eat out of something soft, like your hands. I bent down to let the shy, somewhat withdrawn Miranda take her meal. The pecking movement was forceful, although it didn't hurt my palms. I could see why eating off a hard floor would be painful, though. Chickens and turkeys, they don't have fingers, right, said Susie, so they explore the world with their beaks. Indeed, the sensitive beak contains more nerve endings than a human fingertip. They're curious too. To cut off a bird's beak just makes no sense. Susie told me the industrial agriculture debeaks the birds, always without anaesthetic, to stop them maiming and killing each other when they fight, which they do because of the terribly cramped conditions in which they're kept. In a nearby pen was the newest arrival, a young cow, Chandini. Before she arrived, the rescuers told Susie she was a calf, but Susie inspected her teeth and discovered she was at least 1 year old. She's tiny though, said Susie, as we watched Chandini eat. You shouldn't be able to see her jaw. I'm worried because if she's this small, then there might be something wrong with her. Chandini had come from New York, where a Hindu family had bought her as a gift for their priest as part of a religious celebration. However, the priest lived in Brooklyn and couldn't take a cow. The family panicked, they rang around, and finally Farm Sanctuary agreed to take her in. I asked Susie what she thought of the family who purchased Chandini. Makes no sense, right? She answered. We hiked to the top pasture to move the other cows, who'd been mooing since the previous evening when they'd run out of grass to eat. As we approached, the angle of the slope hid the size of the cows, but now I could grasp just how enormous they were. The back legs of the black and white Holstein Friesians were perhaps 8 foot in height. I'm unsure why I didn't know why cows grew this large, and commented on this to Susie. That's because they're dairy, she responded. In the dairy industry, male cows never grow to maturity. Beef cows, which can still weigh in at over 1,000 pounds, are smaller and have shorter legs. But these Holstein Friesians were as big as oxen. Seeing them brought home to me how impoverished our contemporary experience with the actual bodies of living farmed animals is. As we looked up at the cows waiting by the gate, Susie shouted to one of them, "Sonny!" Immediately the cow replied with a bellow. Susie laughed. "I bottle-fed him," she said. Sonny is depicted in Joanne MacArthur's book We Animals and Liz Marshall's film The Ghosts in Our Machine. Perhaps because of his gregarious personality, but also because of what happened to him, is emblematic of the callousness of industrial farming. Sonny was less than a day old when activists from the sanctuary found him lying in a filthy stockyard pen. As a male calf, he was useless to the dairy industry, and most calves are sold off at these stockyards for a few dollars as veal or cheap beef. His umbilical cord had been torn off, leaving an open wound. He was dehydrated, exhausted, and infected. Without intervention, he would have died after a few hours of misery. "Makes no sense, right?" said Susie. And that was the phrase that Susie kept coming back to, that so much makes no sense when it comes to how non-humans are treated. As full of laughter and smiles and compassion as Susie was, she made me wonder if this verbal tick was something of a safety valve in the face of so much suffering, that it makes no sense to push a chicken's body until it breaks, that it makes no sense to buy a cow for someone who lives in a Brooklyn apartment, that it makes no sense to leave a day-old calf to die alone and in pain. But Susie, it seemed to me, was engaged in the work of sense-making. Her job was to make sense of and out of human cruelty, not least by returning the senses to the traumatised non-human bodies she cared for. Such sense or sense-making lies at the heart of the relationship between bodies. It's a relationship that Susie has with these animals and they with her. It made me think, making sense is a physical act, enacted as Susie wrestles with a goat to give him his antibiotics, or holds and soothes a traumatised chicken, or bottle feeds an orphaned calf. In economic terms, these relationships make no sense. In terms of restoring the senses and rejecting the numbing cruelties of factory farming, however, this work is eminently sensible. The experiences and knowledges of working with and caring for animals is a corporeal and material practice, one that based on our recalibrated relationship with animals, produces a different kind of corporeal and material knowledge. For things to make sense, we must actually sense them. It's why Susie kept coming back to that phrase. For her, animal exploitation does not make sense. The opposite of sense-making is, in this case, trauma. So sense-making is transformative. Indeed, it's an example of transformative justice, a relational and educational opportunity for victims, offenders, and all other members of the affected community to come to peace together following trauma and violence, and to co-create a future. What sanctuaries offer, and what Farm Sanctuary in particular offers, is a chance for a new narrative to develop. The words we use to describe other animals change when the sanctuary is setting. She or he has a gender. She or he is someone, not something. She or he is a who, not a what. Their trauma is released through the body-to-body contact and the caregiving, trust, and acceptance. And this goes, as Jean said earlier, both ways. It heals us as well. Providing the individuals, named, noticed, given particular care as a being in her or himself, a chance to put the traumatic incident into its place in their narrative of their lives is central to their recovery. And that is why sanctuaries are so important. They bring around true physical change. Thank you.
There is, I guess, a study that says that animal agriculture actually contributes more greenhouse gas than transportation. I think that's a whole world figure. So my question kind of leads to these ruminants. Of course, they're defined as animals that have enteric fermentation and are belching methane being 20 times worse than CO2. But, and of course, some of the ruminants are free, but a lot of them are owned.
Yeah.
And is there a way that we can charge the owners for the methane that's being kicked off, in the concept of carbon pricing?
Yeah, I think what is changing at the global level is an understanding of the impact of animal agriculture, and it's becoming a very, very clear message. For example, China recently said that its plan is to reduce meat consumption by 50% because of its understanding of it wanting to move towards a more sustainable practice. And globally, those messages are starting to be taken more seriously, particularly as investors become aware of the opportunities in plant-based diets. And we spoke actually the other night also about cultured meat and clean meat, as it's becoming known as. So in terms of the people who set global governance policy, who make the huge multi-billion-pound investments, those things are changing. And perhaps one of the best vehicles for that that's happening at the moment is in the UK. There's an organisation called the Jeremy Collar Foundation that is working on a project called FAIR, F-A-I-R-R, which is about essentially disinvestment from animal agriculture. It's pointing out the risks of animal agriculture. So in there, they're actually saying things that are very similar to that suggestion in terms of that animal agriculture is such a risk, both as an investment for those investing and for the environment and for people, that there are going to be new taxes on it. There are going to be new costs. There are going to be higher costs. So that's actually, one of the, I'm not sure about if there's that idea exactly, but there are organisations now looking at what extra costs, what have been externalities get pushed over there in terms of cost of the environment, rather than it being here as in the cost of the producer. So those questions are being looked at. So what I would suggest to you is actually to write to the Jeremy Collar Foundation, look at the work that they're doing and actually and feed into their processes of thinking about how can we show the true cost of animal agriculture. And one of those ways could be through levies and taxes. Yeah.
I'm just curious to see bit about UK living EU in terms of animal activists.
Okay.
Could you repeat your question?
Yes, so the question was what might be the impact of the UK leaving the EU. One is that I might move to Scotland. I tried, in fact, one of the first things I tried, I contacted my auntie and said, was my grandmother, was she born in Ireland? And again, sadly not, no, so it might be moved to Scotland or moved here. It's actually quite disastrous. There are, the EU, is imperfect, like all big political sort of structures, it is imperfect. But there's a very simple answer to that, which would be, do I trust the European Union more than I trust the Conservative Party in the UK? Absolutely. Particularly with animal rights. The new Prime Minister who's come in to the UK has made it very clear that she wants to repeal the hunting ban. She sat down for dinner with Francois Hollande last night to discuss Brexit, and the dinner they had included veal. There is very, very little care within the right-wing political classes in the UK for animals. And most of the good work that has come for animals has actually come through left-wing parties in the UK, not all, this is generalisation, but not all, and from EU legislation. So when we leave the EU, if we leave, we're hoping that we can still do something about it, but if we leave, there is an awful lot of good EU legislation, such as payments to farmers. Our farmers get lots of subsidies from the EU, but a lot of those subsidies are actually to create wildlife corridors and to look after pollinators. And the best farmers are the ones who have agrarian land, so they're growing crops, and they are also growing these wildlife corridors. That will probably disappear. We've also got some great equality legislation in the UK that comes from the EU. So we have a 2010 Equality Act, which fed into our 2012 Workplace Legislations Act, which means that as a vegan at work, my rights as a vegan and my beliefs as a vegan are respected, which means that if I make a complaint that the buffet at work in lunch needs to be vegan or I can't come, my workplace has to take that very seriously. And if we leave the EU, we might lose that legislation. So it's on balance, it's a much, much better thing for Europe as well as for us that Britain would stay. It would be a much, much better thing for the animals in the long run. What we can do about that, I'm not sure. There is in the UK at the moment Progressive Alliance forming around for those of us who believe we have more in common and would like to be part of the EU. So. We've gone through those 7 stages, haven't we? Sort of like grief and anger and denial, and now we're coming out in terms of thinking maybe there's a new one of maybe we're still in denial, to be honest, that we may not yet leave, but overall the picture doesn't look good for animals in terms of leaving the EU. I'm someone who's always quite believed in like the yin-yang balance, and sort of when bad things happen, like good things come out of that. And if it stimulates the UK to actually work harder, if it stimulates more activists and advocates coming out of this to work for animals, then that in itself would be a good thing. So.
Sort of related to that, I'm very curious about the vegan and animal rights movement in the UK, because I don't hear about it very much. So I guess I'm curious, what are some things that are happening there that you haven't necessarily seen here, or some exciting developments, things we could learn from the UK?
Yeah, sure. Historically, the UK has been, obviously the Vegan Society, the word vegan was coined by Donald Watson in 1944 in the UK. And actually, it's very interesting when you look back at some of the material from the first 10 years of the Vegan Society, so from 1944 to 1954, they were both very, very ethical, very strict, and very intersectional. So they were talking about climate change in the 1940s, and relating it to issues of sort of like compassion for animals and compassion for the world. So we've got that history, but the history of our relationship to animals in the UK has very much been dominated by conservation and wildlife organisations such as the RSPB, Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, and others, and the Greenpeace and Wildlife Fund, which do not have a vegan ethic, which is the best way to put it, I think. And therefore, a lot of the way that we relate to animals in the UK is through thinking of them as wildlife and nature. The vegan society has actually really sort of started to mould itself in a more active role in the last few years, perhaps under pressure from new organisations that have come into the space, such as the Vegan Lifestyle Association. So the Vegan Society is you're vegan or you're not, you're in or you're out. Vegan Lifestyle Association is a pathway, so you can be, you're just a meat reducer, but you're interested, so you can join, and it's much more inclusive. So that's been a really interesting development. And one of the new developments that's going to happen is that Europe's largest vegan organisation, VBU, in Germany, is expanding out into other European countries, and they're coming to the UK as well. And again, they're in between these two in some ways, in that they have the strong vegan ethic, but they're also a pathway organisation to help people along. And they work with a lot of commercial organisations. So they work with meat-producing organisations to improve the amount and quality and range of vegan options. So and the Veg Fest scene in the UK has absolutely exploded. And I said earlier that it doesn't matter how big the venue, every Veg Fest needs a bigger venue, because there have been hour-long queues out the door, and people paying to get in, $6, $10 to get in, and there have been hour-long queues to get in. Very often people are there for the cake, and that's okay. That's okay, because it means that they're tasting great food, and that's wonderful, and then they're realising that vegan food is not about what's that word that people always use about us? Depredation, yeah, that's it. It's so silly I don't even remember it. It doesn't relate to me as a vegan. So that movement has really expanded, and as has fine dining. In the UK, veganism has been the trend of the last 18 months. Every magazine has run a vegan article. Every auto shop has done a vegan weekly on your tyres. It's like everything is had. It's thumb in the pie, as it were, thumb in the vegan pie. In terms of the animal rights movement, that has also, I think, been shifted along by this. So we have a number of organisations. We have Viva, Animal Equality, Animal Aid, and PETA. They're the big four. But we have a lot of single issue organisations as well, such as like the Badger Trust, like working to stop the cull of badgers. And so animals, those animal rights organisations have actually been quite motivating, and they've had a higher presence as well in the last few years. And we've also learned a lot from over here in North America. So in the UK, for me, I write about it in the book. The last two chapters in my book are about the global save movement. And do people know what I mean when I say that? In terms of the save movement started in Toronto in 2010. And it started by conducting vigils outside slaughterhouses and bearing witness to the animals as they go into the slaughterhouses. And that's been incredibly powerful in terms of a way of reconnecting with these very vulnerable, and soon-to-be dead animals, and giving those who take part a sense of a responsibility and an obligation to bear witness to these things that are so hidden and invisible in our culture. And that's actually really expanding across the UK as well. So we started in Manchester, and it's now moved to about 10 different cities around the UK. And for me, that's a really important thing, because again, it comes back to this understanding of who are we as individuals. We're all human bodies. We all have affects and feelings and emotions, and how we encounter the other, another human or another non-human, it can really change us and really affect us. And one of the things that we're thinking about as a save movement is about this idea of the obligation and the duty to bear witness to the suffering of non-human animals. Not just to know about it, but to go and bear witness. Because once you bear witness, you understand the importance of being a witness. And that's what we're doing. And that's in a way what I've done in writing a book. I wanted to bear witness to the suffering and the deaths of animals. And that, therefore, is something we in the UK have learned, and it's been expanding, and it's been a really, really incredible journey, actually, to watch that grow. if there are no other questions, I understand it's getting quite hot in here, isn't it? We're nearly our time, and I know many people arrived early.
And you'll be able to talk to people in the lobby too.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll
Alex will
stay
be
in
in
the
the
lobby.
lobby talking to people, signing books. So we don't have to exit the building right away, do we, Keith?
Got until 10.
Until 10.
No, wow.
Feel free to hang out, build community, talk, become
But I-
Facebook friends.
So I'd just like to thank everyone for coming along. You know, you may not. I know you probably all came for Gene, it's okay. I'm really glad. I don't want your sympathy, it's absolutely fine. But I'm really glad to have been able to engage and talk to you and to share some conversations. So.